All right. So, yeah, what I'll present to you guys will be life-changing. It will be amazing. It will change your perspective on how you read and write papers. I also want this to be very interactive, so stop me whenever you want to challenge a point or when you want to kind of chime in and share your experience when one of these things that I'll talk about makes sense to you or doesn't make sense or anything. So my talk will be divided in two parts. The first part, I will kind of go through a methodology to read scientific papers. Basically, how can you read it so that you understand the paper instead of just understanding bits and pieces of it, which is what often happens. And in the second part, I will not really tell you how to write a scientific paper, but I'll mainly focus on how you can simplify your writing so that it's understood within the scientific community or the research community. So you're sitting on your desk and you have, these papers in front of you and you don't know where to start, right? Like I will say personally, the first paper I read during my PhD, and I already had a master's, but the first paper I read, it must have taken like, I don't know, 24 hours total for me to understand. So you're sitting on your desk, you have these papers in front of you. What do you do? The first thing to realize is that these papers actually have many components, and that's on purpose. Why does a paper have an abstract, for example? I found that as a weird concept in the beginning, but it's actually because going through a paper, even if it's like 8 pages or 6 pages, is such a heavy task that you need kind of an abstract in the beginning to guide you through that task, right? Obviously, there is the title that tells you something about the paper. The authors tell you something. The images and the plots tell you something. So every component of the paper has a job. And so when do you go through each component? So in the following few slides, I will describe something called the 3-pass approach. So this is not really my idea. This is in this paper that I linked to here, and I can share those slides later as well. It's called How to Read a Paper. It's published in the Communications, SIGCOM Special Interest Group on Communications, research community, but I think it applies more generally as well. And so in the first pass of of reading the paper, actually, before I get into this, any comments or questions so far? Pause for 5 seconds. Yeah, okay, maybe not yet. But so the first thing you want to do is to get a general idea about the paper. So before you invest, hours and hours of reading a scientific paper, you want to get a, is there a chat thing? Link to paper. So you want to get a general idea about the paper, sorry. So how do you do that? So remember, I said there are many components to that paper. The first thing you do is you read the title, you read the abstract, go through the paper and just read the section headers. What is this paper composed of? What are the components of that paper? And then read the conclusion. And often the abstract tells you kind of a summary of the paper, but the conclusion tells you what you learned, what you should have learned by reading that paper. What did it add to kind of the current research community? And also skim the references really quickly, because the references will either ring a bell with you if you've seen referred to papers before, or you will kind of quickly understand where is this paper situated? Is it in the, I don't know, image classification research area, or is it in semantic segmentation, or is it in speech or audio, or like what are the papers that inspire this paper, and what are the papers that constitute the ideas in the current paper you're reading? So that's it, read nothing else. So this should be a really fast pass. And at that point, you should have a general idea about the paper. And you should be able to answer these 5 questions. So the category, so what type of paper is this? Is it a measurement paper? In this example, they say measurement paper or an analysis or a description of a prototype. Is it an applied paper? Is it a theoretical paper? Where does it stand? And the second thing is the context. So what other papers is it related to? So that often comes when you skim either the section headers or the references. Are there any theoretical bases used to analyze the problem? The third thing is correctness, and you can't really judge this to a full extent just by in stage one, but basically the conclusion will tell you what the conclusions of the paper are, what the authors arrived at, and you now skim the paper and you know a bit about how the paper is formulated. So do the assumptions appear to be valid? So you should ask yourself that question. What are the paper's main contributions, obviously, that you can get from the abstract typically? And clarity, is the paper well written? Are the section headers, do they make sense? Even the text of the section headers themselves, are they descriptive enough? Is the abstract well written? Is the conclusion well written? So you should be able to kind of answer these questions. And you know what? Maybe 6 out of 10 papers, you'll stop here. So you'll only skim it. You'll only go through the abstract and conclusion. You will know what the paper is about, but maybe this isn't exactly the point where you're doing your research project or what you're interested in. So you can stop here. You don't actually have to read the whole paper before you move on to the next one. But if this paper is good, go into the second kind of pass. And the second pass is a bit slower. So here we will actually read the text and definitely look at all the figures. But in the second pass, you don't want to read it in such detail that you can reproduce the proofs and you understand all of the methodology. Like, for example, the first paper I wrote during my PhD, I had a page and a half about exactly how we synthesized a computer chip using Synopsys design compiler and using 65 nanometer technology node. And I need to put all of that in the paper because other people should be able to reproduce it. They should understand exactly how we got these results, and they should have the methodology to trust the results. But at this point, that's not your job. At this point, you're just trying to grasp the contents. That's why there's actually a lot of boilerplate in some scientific papers. It differs from research community to another. Like in computer science now, it's nice because people release their code a lot. So you often don't have to write a lot of details about your experiments in the paper. Maybe they move to the appendix or something. But in other research communities, especially hardware or computer architecture, there is actually a lot of stuff that goes in there that's not interesting. So try to kind of hone in on that and skip it. So in computer science context, skip the proofs, skip the methodology, but focus on the text and the figures, especially the plots, the graphs, and so on. And at this point, you should be able to write a summary of that paper. You should be able to describe that paper to your colleague and so on, but obviously not reproduce it. Again, interrupt me if there's anything, or write in the chat box, although I'm not sure I know where it is, but yeah. And then the third pass of the paper, that's where you'll spend hours and hours kind of hunched over your desk, and you'll read all of the details of that paper, and you'll go through all of the proofs. And again, you don't have to move from step 2 to step 3. In fact, I think maybe 9 out of 10 papers I read, I stop at stage 2. I don't need to go through the proofs. Maybe I trust this research group, although you shouldn't really trust anyone. But maybe you're not interested in kind of reproducing their exact methodology. You just want to compare to it. So at that point, stop at stage 2 and spare yourself kind of the time of reading this paper in detail. But if that's kind of your PhD point, and if you really need to understand this methodology, move on to stage 3. So at that point, once you're done with stage 3, you should be able to recreate that paper. Short of running the experiments, maybe someone just gives you the results, but you should be able to rederive all the proofs. You should be able to rewrite the whole paper, at least in your head. You don't have to actually physically write it. And you should be able to walk through the paper from memory as well. So that's basically when you focus on every part of the text, you read it through again, and you go through all of the stuff you skipped in step 2. Yeah, so at this point, I should mention that stage 1 is kind of a 5 to 10 minute thing, so it should be really fast. Stage 2, which is most papers you read, it should take about 1 hour. Maybe if it's a longer paper, I would say 1 hour for an 8-page kind of paper. If it's a longer paper, maybe that will be a bit more, but basically just to read the text, go through the figures. That's all. That's basically your job. So that's just an hour. But if you really want to do that detailed walkthrough, then we're talking about 1 to 6 hours. Like I said, when I was kind of a new PhD student, it took about, I don't know, maybe 12 or 24 hours for the first few papers I read. Yeah, so that's about it. So I have a question from Abu Bakr, which is, how much time do I spend reading papers? I would say maybe 25% of my work time is actually reading papers. So I'm in a research lab in Samsung, and I spend a lot of time reading papers. A, I like to do it, and B, it's just necessary because in our field, things move so quickly and there are so many papers. You always need to do kind of this step one here, basically skim a lot of papers, have a mental model of what paper connects to what in what way, and so on. And where do I find papers? Whenever there's a conference, I basically skim the papers there. And now conferences are subdivided by kind of research topic. Like, for example, at iClear, there was, sessions about pruning, sessions about, deep learning, sessions about, I don't know, computer vision or something like that. So I usually focus on the ones I care about. And then sometimes, I discuss a lot with my colleagues as well. Sometimes I find papers by just talking to people and they point me to other papers. But basically, I think the systematic methodology for finding papers is whenever there's a conference, skim the papers there. Make sure you're aware of what was published in that conference. And then Asad Rahim asks, how do I find papers? I think that's, I think I answered that basically, but if it's still unclear, let me know. These questions need a whole session. Yeah, that's true. Okay. Another piece of advice, I hope I'm not running short of time or something, but whenever you're reading a paper, it's quite a boring task, right? Like it's, try to engage more than one of your senses. And that's actually, I tried to find kind of a reference for it or an image to put in this slide, but I found this article about how sensory activities help kids learn. But this is actually like, we're either all kids or we all learn in the same way. So basically try to engage more than one of your senses or more than one of your abilities. And this really helped me. I can actually never focus in a lecture without taking notes. Sometimes I throw away the notes afterwards, but the act of taking notes itself really helps me to understand what's being said. Otherwise, I fall asleep sometimes. So when I'm reading a paper, I always have a highlighter in my hand. I always jot notes on the margins. And sometimes I also have kind of a notebook and I write a summary as I'm going along. So that's my advice. Sometimes it helps to read out loud as well, especially if it's a specific part it's just not, sticking. Just read it out loud to yourself. So you're kind of engaging both your listening and your speech. Writing, obviously, you're engaging your hand and stuff. And the last thing is explain the paper or topic to someone. And I used to explain a lot to my mom, and she's very patient. But I mean, that someone could be anyone. It doesn't have to be someone who understands your research field. And that actually, if you simplify something enough for your mom to understand it, that's when kind of you've grasped that topic. Yeah, I want to focus again on summarizing the paper. I used to have this kind of just document with summaries of papers, and it was really useful when I wanted to get back to it and writing kind of that introduction and literature review section of my thesis, or just when I'm writing a new paper and I want to go over the literature and stuff. So creating those one paragraph summaries with just some snippets from the paper, like I would copy a figure and the most important figure and write a one paragraph summary. That was really useful. The next one is follow the paper trail. Oh, I think there are questions. Something's flashing. Sake of time, we should end in a couple. Oh man. Okay. Oh yeah, maybe we can do the English stuff later. So do you use services software like Mendeley? Cowchick. Wait one slide. Yeah. So yeah, follow the paper trail. reading one paper is never, maybe this is obvious, but is never enough. Go through the references, find what other papers are interesting. Look in arXiv now, you can see what papers cite this paper and what papers are referred to in this paper. So kind of follow that graph of papers and read other stuff as well. Mendeley, I use Mendeley. I'm going to stop using it soon because they discontinued their iPad app. So I read on my iPad and highlight on my iPad. It's my whole life, and then they canceled this app. So I'm really sad. But in general, I really recommend these citation tools, or what reference management tools they're called. So if you're not aware of them, search for Mendeley, and you can start there. There are other tools as well, but yeah, there's EndNote. There are other ones. Zotero, I think, but I'm in the process of actually looking at other tools because they discontinued the iPad app here. Some miscellaneous notes. When I was preparing this, I chatted with a bunch of people I know, and so I had paper summaries that came up again. A colleague called Alex, he said, you know, he also does this two-step process in his case. He skims the paper and then reads it in detail. He actually sleeps in the middle. So it's not like in the middle of the day, you just go to sleep. It's like he reads it in one day and then goes to sleep. And then the next day he reads the paper in detail. And there is some research that shows that this helps like in understanding and retention when you have sleeping in the middle, but so yeah, so this may help. My wife says she does a one-sentence summary of each paper and she sticks it in an Excel sheet with a link to the paper. So now she has this kind of really long list of papers, one summary telling her what this was about, and then she just clicks on it and she can go there. So that could be useful to people as well. Writing, I guess we'll leave the writing part till next time, and that may be useful. I'll just show one slide as a teaser. So the stuff in the writing part is mainly from a course I took during my PhD. And here is the example. Like if you look at this image, it's a very weird image actually of an octopus eating a seagull. This was written in CBC, which is a Canadian kind of news outlet, a newspaper and stuff. So it was written, octopus eating seagull captured in photos. So that's kind of a really unclear way of saying what's happening in this image. They actually corrected their news release later and then octopus eats seagull. So I would say kind of most of our scientific writing is written in the format in the top here. You'd find a very long twisted sentence, but it's actually saying something that's really simple. So so yeah, that course again was life-changing to me. And it really helps when you're kind of simplifying your writing. But yeah, I'll stop here because we need to continue the seminar. But happy to take any questions.